The 6th of June, 1944. D-Day begins as Allied troops land on the beaches of Normandy. Mines, barbed wire, and machine gun fire turn the shore into killing grounds. Every step forward is bought with blood, but Europe's liberation depends on it. In the following months, as the Third Reich collapses under the relentless advance of the Allied forces, millions of German soldiers surrender on the Western Front, a figure that far exceeds both Allied expectations and logistical capabilities. American troops, having just uncovered the horrors of Hitler's regime and the concentration camps such as Dachau and Mauthausen, feel little sympathy for the defeated Nazis and want to give them a taste of their own medicine. The vast majority of prisoners are marched into open fields along the Rhine River, where they spend weeks or even months under open skies. The once proud soldiers of the Third Reich are subjected to constant beatings, brutal interrogations, and relentless hunger. With no shelter, they dig holes in the ground with their bare hands. With no food, they eat grass, and with no water, they are forced to drink their own urine. As a result, thousands of prisoners fall ill, and many die from exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease. The place where this dark chapter of post-war suffering unfolds in the spring and summer of 1945 becomes known as the Rheinwiesenlager, or Rhine Meadow Camps. After Western Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, and launched their long-planned offensive in Western Europe, they advanced across France and the Low Countries, battling entrenched German forces and liberating one occupied territory after the other. As they crossed into German territory, Allied troops uncovered the true scale of Nazi atrocities. In camps like Buchenwald, Mauthausen, and Dachau, they found mass graves, gas chambers, and survivors on the brink of death, horrifying evidence of the Holocaust. The Nazis had murdered an estimated 6 million Jews across Europe in a state-organized campaign of genocide that included deportations, forced labor, and industrialized mass murder in extermination camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing from both east and west. Its transport systems were paralyzed, cities lay in ruins, and the commanders of the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, began ignoring Hitler's desperate orders to fight to the last man. Instead, many sought to surrender to the Americans or British, hoping to avoid falling into Soviet hands. Waves of German soldiers laid down their arms, often without resistance. Civilians, too, fled westward by the thousands, terrified of what Red Army revenge might bring. In this final phase of the war, Allied forces found themselves in possession of far more prisoners than they had ever anticipated, and they were woefully unprepared for what came next. Faced with the overwhelming surrender of German forces in the final weeks of the war, the Western Allies were confronted with an unprecedented logistical challenge. By early 1945, approximately half of all German soldiers captured in the West were held by US forces, while the other half were under British custody. However, in late March, as Allied troops crossed the Rhine and advanced into the German heartland, the number of German prisoners surged dramatically. The British, unable to accommodate more, ceased accepting additional captives, placing the full burden on the US military, which was now compelled to act swiftly and independently. Initially, the Allied plan had been to transfer prisoners of war to Britain or the United States, where food and shelter were more readily available. This approach had been effective earlier in the war, with captives from North Africa, Italy, and France. However, the rapid collapse of Germany rendered this option impractical. By the 30th of April 1945, the Western Allies held over 3.15 million German prisoners across all theaters of war, and that number would dramatically continue to rise after the war ended. In March 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe, approved a policy reclassifying captured German soldiers as disarmed enemy forces. Under this legal framework, the prisoners were no longer granted the full protections of the Geneva Convention, which ordinarily guaranteed three key rights: that prisoners of war would be fed and sheltered to the same standard as the base troops of the capturing power, allowed to send and receive mail, and regularly visited by delegates of the International Committee of the Red Cross. By removing prisoner of war status, the Allies aimed to simplify logistics and avoid legal obligations toward soldiers of Nazi Germany, a state that had ceased to exist. The official rationale behind the creation of the camps extended beyond simple containment. The Allies were concerned about the possibility of a post-war Nazi insurgency. There were fears that die-hard units might refuse to surrender, go underground, and wage a guerrilla war against the occupying forces. By securing and isolating the bulk of the German military as quickly as possible, the Allies hoped to prevent any such organized resistance from ever forming. In response, the United States established a series of large temporary prisoner camps along the western bank of the Rhine, facilities that would become known as the Rheinwiesenlager or Rhine Meadow Camps. A total of 19 camps were constructed and collectively held between 1 and nearly 2 million surrendered Wehrmacht personnel from April until September 1945. These camps were located on flat, unused farmland near railway lines and existing infrastructure, which made them easier to supply and administrate. The sites were enclosed with barbed wire and subdivided into sections, each housing between 5,000 and 10,000 men. Field paths served as makeshift streets, and nearby buildings were converted into kitchens, infirmaries, and offices. In May 1945, the 106th U.S. Infantry Division was assigned to guard the prisoners. To meet the demands of the operation, the division was expanded to 40,000 men, making it the largest ever to serve in the U.S. Army. Due to the sheer volume of prisoners, the Americans handed over internal administrative tasks such as food distribution, medical care, and labor to the prisoners themselves. The living conditions inside the Rheinwiesenlager camps quickly collapsed into hardship and disorder, as tens of thousands of surrendered German soldiers arrived in the spring of 1945. Although these facilities were originally meant to serve as temporary holding areas, they were soon overwhelmed by sheer numbers. After arriving, many of the men, exhausted, underfed, and disorientated, were subjected to strip searches and interrogations. Often unaware of Allied procedures and fearful for their lives, they were sometimes led to believe they would be executed unless they confessed to crimes they may or may not have committed. Following these interrogations, they were herded into barbed wire enclosures and left to fend for themselves. They rarely received food or water. Fresh clothing and medical assistance were practically non-existent. Basic needs such as nourishment, hydration, and healthcare were left unmet. The majority of prisoners had no shelter at all, and tried to dig shallow holes into the earth for cover against the cold and rain, using only their bare hands. In many camps, however, even this was forbidden. The result was rows of men lying exposed on soaked fields, with no protection from the harsh spring weather. Approaching the fence to ask for supplies could lead to being shot. Yet staying put meant facing slow starvation or dying from typhus, cholera, and other diseases that spread rapidly in the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. George Weiss, a former German tank mechanic, later recalled how, during one stretch of 3.5 days without any access to water, some men ended up drinking their own urine. Such desperate conditions were not isolated incidents, but reflected the larger reality in many of these enclosures. One such camp was located near the town of Bad Kreuznach in the Rhineland, a region southwest of Frankfurt. There, newly arrived detainees, many of them wounded or ill, were added to a mass of already imprisoned German soldiers and civilians. Private Heinz T., who had just turned 18 and had been recovering in hospital, was taken to this camp, wearing only shorts, shoes, and a shirt. His account, along with others, reveals that in the absence of food, prisoners were sometimes reduced to eating grass. The camps also held German civilians who had been swept up in the chaos of the war's end. These included elderly men, women, some of them pregnant, and even children as young as 6. At first, some tried to build fires using branches from nearby trees, but the guards swiftly extinguished them. No heating was permitted. Sanitary conditions were appalling. With makeshift latrines consisting only of logs laid over ditches, many prisoners, weak from hunger and illness, defecated directly on the ground. Clothing became soiled, mud turned infectious, disease spread quickly, and death often came in a matter of days. Charles von Lüttichau, who had voluntarily surrendered to the United States forces near the town of Remagen, located on the western bank of the Rhine, was taken to Camp Kripp. There, prisoners were kept in crowded wire enclosures under the open sky with minimal food. For more than half the time, they received no rations at all. When food was issued, it amounted to a fraction of what the American soldiers were given. The caloric intake was dangerously low, far below the level needed to sustain health, and certainly not enough to support men already weakened by months or years of war. Charles von Lüttichau complained to the American camp commander about violations of the Geneva Convention, but was told by the commander, "Forget the convention. You haven't any rights." Burial operations became part of the daily routine. In Rheinberg camp, former prisoner Wolfgang Iff recalled that in his section of roughly 10,000 men, between 30 and 50 bodies were collected each day. Assigned to the burial detail, he helped to move the corpses to the camp's entrance. There, the dead were stripped of clothing, tagged, and stacked in layers with quicklime poured between them. Many had succumbed to gangrene after frostbite, a result of the wet and unseasonably cold spring weather. Others had drowned after falling into the open latrine ditches, too weak to hold themselves up. The overall state of the Rheinwiesenlager camps was so dire that, according to a report by the United States Army Medical Department, some of the enclosures resembled Andersonville Prison in 1864, a grim reference to one of the most infamous American Civil War prisoner of war camps, notorious for overcrowding, starvation, and rampant disease. The food shortage across the camps mirrored the wider crisis facing post-war Germany. On the 25th of April, 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower wrote to the combined chiefs of staff warning that unless immediate action was taken to provide food, chaos and mass starvation were unavoidable. Even before Germany's official surrender, Eisenhower's calculations had proven far too optimistic. Instead of the anticipated 3 million prisoners, more than twice that number of German soldiers had already surrendered to the Western Allies, many of them fleeing west to escape the advancing Soviet Red Army. In the days and weeks following Germany's capitulation on the 8th of May, 1945, that number would continue to rise, eventually exceeding 7.6 million in Northwest Europe. Throughout the summer of 1945, the overcrowded Rheinwiesenlager camps continued to struggle with shortages of food, shelter, and medical supplies. Yet despite the crisis, the International Committee of the Red Cross was not allowed to inspect these American-run camps until autumn, by which time most had already closed or were being dismantled. It was not until February 1946 that the Red Cross was finally permitted to deliver limited aid. Delegates who visited described the conditions as appalling. According to official United States Army records, just over 3,000 German prisoners of war died in the Rheinwiesenlager. German sources estimate about 4,537 deaths. These numbers reflect only the camps along the Rhine. When expanded to include all German prisoner of war camps held by Western Allied forces between 1945 and 1946, a total of about 7.75 million, the estimated death toll rises to between 10 and 40,000. While tragic, this broader number still falls within the expected range of natural mortality under the extreme conditions of post-war Europe. Decades later, however, these numbers became the center of a major controversy. In 1989, Canadian author James Back published Other Losses, a book that accused the United States of covering up the deaths of up to 1 million German prisoners. However, Back's theory has been widely discredited by historians. In addition, if so many Germans had died in US custody, their graves would be impossible to hide. Yet decades of construction, farming, and Red Cross inspections have uncovered no mass burials or evidence of systematic killings. World War II in Europe lasted from the 1st of September 1939 to the 8th of May 1945. And claimed an estimated 60 million lives, a catastrophe unleashed by Nazi Germany's aggression. Among the victims were 6 million Jews, systematically murdered in a genocide that erased 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population and 1/3 of all Jews worldwide. While 0.1 to 0.5% of German prisoners of war died in Western captivity, the death rate of Soviet camps exceeded 35%. Thanks for watching the World History Channel. Be sure to like and subscribe, and click the bell notification icon so you don't miss our next episodes. We thank you, and we'll see you next time on the channel.